Psychiatric ward workers. What was the strangest experience? My clients have dementia, and there's one who creeps me out a lot. During the day, she's the sweetest old lady, but at night she sleep talks. And it's not normal sleep talking. Her eyes are open, and sometimes she's sitting up. Sometimes it's impossible to tell when she has gone from sleeping to being awake, until she turns to you and asks if you've seen the little girl that was just here, that she was talking to. She talks about people being there all the time, including a little boy that has died, and she wonders what we should do with the body, a little girl that sleeps with her, a man that orders her around, and her dead husband who is always looking for her. I heard her talking once, and she was being very loud, but as I reached the open doorway, she said, "Shh, they're all sleeping. Better not talk about it now." And she promptly stopped talking and just lay there very still. That's pretty unsettling. Sounds like the boundaries between her dreams and reality are really blurred. The way she interacts with what she sees must make for an eerie atmosphere. It's strange how some moments feel so real to her, like she's having conversations with people who aren't there. It must be a challenge to navigate those situations, especially when you don't know what she might say next. Just made this throwaway specifically to reply here. I'm a counselor in a facility for people experiencing mental health crises. Recently, we had a client who was experiencing active schizophrenic psychosis, with her hallucinations manifesting in the form of demons that follow her around. It was really unsettling seeing her talking to them, and frequently the discussion centered around being drenched in blood. She also wouldn't sleep in her bed and slept on her floor, starfished face down. Checking on her at night was always a little unsettling, seeing someone face down, starfished out like that on the floor. It's a tough situation for both the client and the staff. Dealing with hallucinations can be really difficult, and it must be hard to witness someone in such distress. The way she chose to sleep shows her discomfort. It's good that you were there to check on her, even if it was unsettling. Mental health work can be pretty intense, and these experiences can stick with you. I was a volunteer at a hospital, visiting people in their rooms. I got so good at Scrabble, I could wreck you. One day, one of the ladies got out of the mental health ward and walked out of the hospital. It was pouring rain, and so a bunch of nurses and volunteers went looking out in the parking lot and in the general area for her. I found her in a little bit of green space by a pond overlooking the highway. I slowly walked this old lady mumbling to herself, soaking wet. We get her inside, and she holds onto my wrist and won't let go and keeps talking to me and calling me Brad. I found out afterward Brad's the name of her son. I'm a 5 feet 6 inches Indian guy, so it didn't make sense, but she had this creepy death grip on my hands and kept talking to me like I was her son. She didn't let go until 2 nurses pried her hands off me. I didn't see her again, but being a 15-year-old kid who hadn't been volunteering for that long, it certainly freaked me out. That's quite the experience. Took some courage to handle that moment. It's interesting how people in distress can latch onto someone who just happens to be there. It's also a bit strange to be mistaken for someone else, especially in such an emotional situation. I can see why it would make you uneasy, especially since you were still new to volunteering. Definitely a memorable day, even if it was unsettling. I work in an ER, and due to my country/state's poor mental health system, we see acute psychotic episodes daily. Over time, you get desensitized to it, but there is still one that turns my stomach. A guy was found in a burning abandoned building. Wasn't hurt, but was acting so strange the paramedics brought him in. He was homeless, had no ID, did not know his name, had 0 drugs in his system. Looking in his eyes, you could tell he wasn't seeing the same thing I was. So I'm trying to get his name or anything out of him, and he keeps telling me he was a pilot for the Air Force and flew experimental airplanes because he could withstand the G-force and his blood was naturally thin. The blood tests that measure this actually were fairly higher than normal, but not elevated to the point he was on medication for it. So he was right here. I was at the desk telling a coworker about the stuff this guy was saying when a resident overheard me. He was former Air Force as well, and looked like he had seen a ghost. Now I can't remember the name of this place my patient was saying, but as soon as I said it, this doctor was freaked out. He said that city/base has no roads in or out, and a lot of top secret testing goes down there. He said that you don't know about it unless you've been there. He told me not to talk about it or make a big deal. Gave me an even weirder vibe. Thinking about it, I truly think this guy was telling me the truth. When the government was done with him, they scrambled his brain and kicked him to the streets. He can't remember what he did or who he is, and thus poses no threat in sharing information. This also makes him harder to find. Not a conspiracy theorist at all, and psychiatric patients have a lot of paranoia about technology and secret government operations, but this guy seemed real. It's a strange situation. You have this guy, clearly out of touch with reality, but his story sounds almost credible. The reaction of the doctor adds another layer. Makes you think about what really goes on in those secretive military operations. It's unsettling how the system fails people like him, leaving them lost. It's a reminder that not all cases in the ER are straightforward. I remember a year or so ago, one of our revolving door patients was readmitted shortly after being discharged from her last admission. She didn't accept she had a mental disorder, and so upon discharge, immediately stopped taking her meds, became delusional and psychotic. As I walked onto the ward that morning, she collared me, clearly very cross about the circumstances leading to her admission. She had completely disengaged from mental health services and barricaded herself in the house, meaning police had to smash her door down with a battering ram. She seemed remarkably with it when she told me she wanted to lodge an official complaint. She said she wanted a list of all the people present when she was assessed for admission at her house. She knew who most of the professionals were, but she was unable to identify another man present and wanted me to find out who he was. His main identifying feature being that at the time, he was dressed as a vampire. She said the vampire had lots of umbrellas and kept twirling them around before reflecting. They're crackers they are. At this point, I pretty much had to run off the ward to avoid hysterically laughing in her face. I mentioned it after to one of the psychiatrists who assessed her, and she said, "Oh yeah, the vampire. Did we ever find out who that was?" This is an interesting situation. It sounds like the patient had a pretty unique encounter with the staff. The vampire detail makes it even more bizarre. It's not every day you hear about someone getting assessed by a person dressed as a vampire. It's good to see some humor in such a serious setting, but it also highlights the challenges people face with mental health. Definitely a memorable story for those involved. Not my patient, but 16-year-old kid from a religious family in the UK comes into the psych ward after being passed around various doctors for quite some time. He believes he hears both the voice of God and Satan. The devil tells the kid to masturbate, whilst God tells him if he masturbates, he will punish him and his family. Eventually, he gives in to masturbating. He's 16, go figure, and describes something fairly odd. He believes that every time he masturbates, his semen shoots back into his own body and travels up into his spine, and this allows the devil to control him and make him harm his family. He never actually hurt anyone during this, but he would freak out and try and hurt himself to stop the devil from letting him hurt other people. I have no idea what happened because, like I said, not my patient. Chances are he's still out there, still with schizophrenia. No one ever gets rid of these kinds of mental health problems. This is a pretty heavy situation. The kid sounds like he's dealing with a lot of conflicting thoughts. Having voices tell you to do things and feeling that pressure from both sides must be really tough, especially at that age. It's a lot to handle, and it's hard to see a clear path for him. Schizophrenia can be really persistent. Hope he finds some way to cope. My dad is an artist and once did a series of art workshops in psychiatric hospitals for rehabilitation and art therapy and stuff. One day, he's in this picturesque little psych hospital on the coast of Wales, and one of the patients is gleefully telling everyone they saw an angel fly past their window. All of the staff are like, "Of course you did," name, "Of course you did," laugh it off as innocent and adorable. Next time someone goes outside, someone is dead below the upper floor window. They got out somehow and jumped. It wasn't a high-security hospital, but nothing like that had ever happened. They fell right past this guy's window, and he saw them as an angel. My dad was shaken up. That's a pretty intense story. It's interesting how perception can shift so dramatically in moments like that. The contrast between the patient's joy and the tragedy is striking. It must have had a deep impact on your dad. seeing the aftermath of something so dark while being involved in what was meant to be a healing process. Definitely a heavy experience to process. We had a young lady in our custody with quite a few issues. We'll call her Jane. Jane's first night at our facility, staff doing a bed check found Jane in a puddle of blood. Turns out Jane had been slicing the skin around her shin with her fingernails and was pulling her skin up her leg, essentially degloving her calf. And NBSB. Jane also had a ritual she performed every night before bed. While in her room, she would run between walls in her room, touching them in a crucifix pattern. After doing this for a few hours, she would sit on her bed and go to sleep. This particular night, Jane was frantic in her pace, practically running between walls. Our night staff observed the entire interaction and reported Jane screaming late into the night. When the staff went to check on Jane, she reported Jane standing in the doorway smiling. The staff asked what was wrong, and Jane replied, "What makes you think you were speaking to Jane?" This is a pretty intense situation. Jane's behavior is concerning, especially with the injuries in her rituals. Running in a pattern and then acting like someone else changes the whole dynamic. It's a lot of stress not only for her, but for the staff trying to support her. Keeps you thinking about what's really going on in her mind. Hope they can find a way to help her. I've worked in the field now for 3 years, mostly in a role called a behavioral health technician. I've worked in various facilities such as 6-month group homes, 3 to 7 day general mental health/detox crisis centers, as well as an asylum for the criminally insane where patients are there for a minimum of 5 years usually. In the group home, there was a man whose head and face, including eyebrows, were shaved, albeit for a small nub of circular hair on the top of his head. He was nonviolent, but would spend the entire day marching around the small, pretty shitty home. Every so often he would flatly yell out, "Fuck you," and continue marching. We kept a large bin of saltines for the residents to snack on. He would eat all of those regularly in a few sittings. When we had written group work, he would complete the assignment as fast as he could, but the interesting part was that he wrote in all caps that were almost as precise as font from a word processor. Wore all red all the time besides his huge black army-type boots, identified with being punk rock and Nazi, even though he couldn't explain what those ideals even meant when asked. Spoken non sequitur, would tell me that he used to be tall like me, but shrunk a foot or more in recent years. He was in his 30s. It's been a few years since I worked there, so I'm just spouting out the details I remember. The real kicker is the way he was brought to us. Apparently, he was wandering around in the desert, emaciated and red as the desert rocks, when he walked into a fast food joint. Was ordering food to very non-compliant / freaked out employees. Had a chain of paper clips hanging from his ear to his nose. Apparently a little girl caught his eye when he turned around and started screaming. Sent the whole restaurant into a frenzy. Like I said, he was non-violent, so nothing came about from that, but it was the weirdest thing I ever read or heard at that time. That's a pretty wild story. Sounds like you encountered a lot of unique situations in your work. The guy marching around and yelling is definitely memorable. The details about the chain of paper clips and his appearance add a strange twist. It's interesting how people end up in those facilities and their backgrounds. Makes you think about the range of experiences in mental health settings. Not an employee, former patient though, so I've seen what goes on. Honestly, the whole situation itself is just scary. You had people with bandages all over their arms from cutting, one girl who tried to kill herself, but had a job interview while there, former drug addicts, every type of person. I befriended an older woman who was very unhinged and would yell at employees because they wouldn't let her out. I'm pretty sure if she was let go, she would have tried to kill her ex-husband. She was very sad and I felt awful for her, even if she definitely wasn't all there. My second night, there she shows up in front of my room, sobbing uncontrollably about the whole situation. She just wants out, but there was no way they would let her go. We hug and get in trouble for physical contact. She goes off at one of the employees about how I'm the only one helping her during this hard time. It was a lot to handle, as I wasn't really all there myself. I laughed myself to sleep that night of the whole ridiculousness of everything. But it was kind of creepy looking back. I miss her, but I lost her number, so I can't call to check up on her. That sounds like a tough experience. Being in such a chaotic environment with people struggling in different ways can take a toll. It's heavy to see someone in distress and want to help, but also feel overwhelmed yourself. The mix of emotions you felt is understandable. Losing touch with someone you connected with is frustrating, though. Hope you find a way to check in on her sometime.